Everybody knows the story. A brilliant billionaire has a vision of the future. He looks at a world choking on gasoline and he decides, more or less single-handedly, to build the car that saves it. He pours his fortune into it, he bets everything, and against every expert who laughs at him, he wins. The electric car becomes cool. The impossible company becomes the most valuable car maker on the planet. And the man becomes the richest human being alive. It is a clean story. It has a hero, it has a mission, and it has a happy ending. It is also, in almost every important detail, wrong. Tesla did not begin with the man you are picturing. He was not there at the start. He did not have the original idea. He did not build the first car or write the business plan or come up with the name. When the company was founded, he was busy running an entirely different business, a payments company, and he had never designed a vehicle in his life. The people who actually started Tesla are names most of the world has never heard. And by the time the brand became a household word, they had been pushed out of their own creation, one by one, in a series of moves that got so ugly they ended up in court. So let us tell the real version. Not the myth that gets printed on the posters, but the messier, stranger, far more interesting story of where this thing actually came from. Because the truth is that Tesla was born out of a small California startup, a borrowed sports car, a pile of laptop batteries, and a fight for credit that never really ended. The beginning has a date, and it is earlier than most people think. In the summer of 2003, two engineers named Martin Eberhard and Marc Tarpenning incorporated a company. They were not car guys in the traditional sense. Years earlier, they had built and sold a startup that made one of the first real electronic book readers, a device that stored novels on a screen back when the rest of the world still thought of books as paper. They had sold that company for a good deal of money. They were restless, and they were paying close attention to a problem that the entire automotive industry seemed determined to ignore. The question they kept circling was simple. If electric cars were supposedly slow, ugly, and useless, why was that treated as a law of nature instead of a choice? They had noticed something specific. The batteries that powered laptops had been getting quietly, relentlessly better for years. Every generation stored more energy, weighed less, and cost less per unit of power. Nobody in Detroit was thinking about laptop batteries. But if you took thousands of those small cylindrical cells, the same kind sitting inside the machine you might be watching this on, and wired them together into one enormous pack, you could store a genuinely useful amount of energy in a car. Not enough for a cheap commuter box, but maybe enough for something else entirely. There was a proof of concept out there too, if you knew where to look. A small engineering outfit in California had already stuffed a homemade electric drivetrain into a track car, and the thing was violently, absurdly fast. It humiliated gasoline sports cars in a straight line. It was crude, it was a one-off, and it was not for sale. But the founders drove it, or rode in something like it, and they walked away with the same thought. The problem with the electric car was not physics. The problem was that nobody with ambition had ever bothered to build a good one. That was the insight the whole company was built on, and it was a strange one. They decided not to build an affordable car for the masses. They decided to build the opposite. A fast, expensive, desirable sports car aimed at wealthy early adopters who would pay a premium to own something new. The logic was cold and correct. A new technology always starts expensive. You sell it to the people who can afford the first version, you use their money to fund the next version, and you climb down the price ladder one rung at a time until the technology is cheap enough for everyone. They wrote this down. It was an actual document. A plan to build an expensive car first, a less expensive car second, and an affordable car third, each one funding the next. They were not trying to sell a car. They were trying to bootstrap an industry, and they were honest with themselves about how long the ladder was. They named the company after Nikola Tesla, the electrical pioneer whose alternating current systems power the modern world, and whose induction motor design sat, in spirit, at the heart of what they were building. It was a fitting tribute, and it was free advertising. The name sounded like the future. Now, here is where the myth quietly rearranges the furniture. In early 2004, the young company needed money to actually build anything. Eberhard went looking for investors, and the biggest check, a little over $6 million, came from a man who had just sold his stake in an online payments company for a fortune and was hunting for something ambitious to fund. He led the first serious round of investment. In exchange for the money, he became the chairman of the board. He was, at this point, a major investor and the chairman. He was not the founder, and he was not the CEO. Those were different people, and it matters because almost everything you have been told compresses these roles into one man. There was also a fourth and a fifth figure, engineers who joined early and did enormous amounts of the actual technical work, and whose names have been sanded off the story just as thoroughly. A young powertrain engineer in particular, the one who genuinely understood how to make thousands of laptop cells behave like a car battery, was arguably as important as anyone. You have almost certainly never heard of him either. So the money was in. Now they had to build the thing, and this is where the borrowed sports car comes in. Designing a car from a blank sheet of paper costs an unthinkable amount of money and takes years a startup does not have. So they cheated intelligently. They went to a small British car maker that built a light, gorgeous, aluminum-bodied sports car, a nimble little thing beloved by purists, and they essentially started with that. They took the basic shape and structure of an existing Roadster and set about ripping out its gasoline heart and replacing it with electricity. The plan sounded almost simple. Keep the beautiful body, delete the engine, insert the battery and the electric motor, and you have your car. It was not simple. It was never going to be simple. And the gap between how easy it sounded and how brutally hard it turned out to be is the part of the story that nearly killed the company before the public ever saw the result. Here's the number that broke the fantasy. The first serious estimate said the car could be built and sold for around $90,000. That was the promise made to early customers who were asked to put down large deposits, in some cases the full price of the car, years before the car actually existed. Hundreds of wealthy enthusiasts handed over their money on faith. It felt like a real number. It was not. By the time the company actually understood what it was building, the true cost to manufacture each early car had ballooned far past the selling price, in the worst stretch to well over $140,000 a car. They were, in the most literal sense, losing tens of thousands of dollars on every single vehicle they made. The more cars they sold, the more money they lost. That is not a business. That is a countdown. Why did it blow up so badly? Because almost nothing about converting that little British sports car turned out to be a bolt-on job. The battery pack, the heart of the whole idea, was enormous, heavy, and dangerous. Nearly 7,000 small cells packed tightly together generate heat, and lithium cells that overheat do not politely shut down. They can catch fire, and a fire in a pack that size can spread from one cell to the next like a chain of dominoes. So the team had to invent an entire cooling and safety system, sensors and coolant and shielding, to stop the car from becoming a rolling hazard. Then there was the weight. The pack alone weighed close to 1,000 pounds. It was so heavy that the light little chassis they had borrowed was no longer really the same car. It had to be strengthened, widened, and re-engineered until, by the end, the overwhelming majority of the parts were different from the original. They thought they were modifying a car. They were actually building a new one while pretending they were not, and paying the price for the pretense in both money and time. And the transmission. The plan had been to use a 2-speed gearbox to give the car both brutal acceleration off the line and a high top speed. The gearboxes kept destroying themselves. Prototype after prototype came back with the transmission chewed to pieces because nobody had built one to survive the instant, savage torque of an electric motor, which delivers its full twisting force from a standstill. Supplier after supplier failed to crack it. In the end, the company gave up on the 2-speed idea entirely and shipped the first cars with a single-speed gearbox and reworked motor electronics instead. A compromise that quietly cost them months and a fortune. Every one of these problems ate calendar. Every month of calendar ate money the company was steadily running out of. Now let us talk about the real revenue mechanism, because the sports car itself was never actually the point. This is the part that separates the people who understood the plan from the people who thought Tesla was just a car company that got lucky. The Roadster was bait. It was a beautiful, fast, headline-grabbing loss leader whose real job was to do 3 things that had nothing to do with the profit on any individual car. First, it existed to prove that an electric car did not have to be a sad, slow appliance shaped like an egg. It could beat a gasoline sports car off the line, reach 60 miles an hour in under 4 seconds, and turn heads doing it. That single demonstration destroyed the excuse the entire auto industry had been hiding behind for decades. The comfortable lie that customers simply did not want electric cars. Second, it existed to attract the money and the talent needed to build the next car and the one after that. A working, desirable product is the single best fundraising tool there is. And third, and most importantly, it existed to fund the technology, the batteries, the motors, the software, the entire electric backbone that would eventually be poured into a car normal people could actually afford. The company was never really selling cars in those early years. It was selling a story about the future and using that story to raise the money to make the future real. The physical car was almost a prop. The real product was belief, and belief converts into investment. An investment buys the years of runway you need to climb down the price ladder from a $100,000 toy to a mass market machine. Every expensive car sold, every magazine cover, every celebrity seen behind the wheel was a rung. That was the mechanism. Not margin. Momentum. The margin on the car itself was negative for years. It did not matter as long as the momentum kept the fundraising alive. But momentum is expensive, and momentum was exactly what nearly ran out. Here are the structural traps, the things that quietly kill a company that is doing almost everything right. The first was the cost-death spiral we already talked about, selling below cost with no near-term path to ever fixing it. Because fixing it required the cheaper car, which required survival, which required money, which required the belief that the cheaper car was coming. It was a loop that only worked if you never blinked. The second trap was time itself. Every engineering delay pushed the first deliveries further out, which meant more months of paying engineers and factories and lawyers while zero revenue came in. Which meant going back to investors, hat in hand, again and again to raise more money just to survive long enough to ship a single car. The company raised round after round, each one diluting the last, each one buying just enough runway to reach the next crisis. And the third trap, the quietest and the deadliest, was that all of this was happening inside a company that was tearing itself apart from the inside. As the costs spiraled and the deadlines slipped, the blame started flying. The board, led by the chairman who had put in the most money, lost confidence in the founder running the company day to day. In a brutal stretch, the original founder, Eberhard, was removed as chief executive, then eased off the board, then out of the company altogether. The man who had started the whole thing shone the door of his own creation. Interim chief executives came and went. Then a second wave of cuts hit, roughly a quarter of the staff gone in a single stroke as the company braced for something even worse than internal politics. Because outside the building, the entire global economy was walking toward a cliff. The car finally reached its first customers in 2008. And 2008 was, as anyone alive at the time will remember, the worst possible year to be a company that burned cash and sold expensive luxury toys. The financial system was collapsing. Banks that had stood for a century vanished in a weekend. Credit froze solid. The established, century-old car makers, giants with enormous factories and vast dealer networks and millions of customers, were themselves lurching toward bankruptcy and lining up to beg the government for rescue. And here in the middle of that inferno stood a tiny California startup with a single, wildly expensive product, no profit. A public history of blowing through every deadline it had ever set, and a cash balance draining towards zero by the week. By December of 2008, the company was days away from death. Not months, days. The bank accounts were nearly empty. Payroll was in genuine question. One more failed fundraising round and Tesla would have become a footnote, a clever idea that ran out of road at exactly the wrong moment in history. The fight over who really ran the company and who deserved the credit had already cost the original founders their positions. The man who had come in as an investor and chairman had, through the crisis, taken the chief executive seat himself, poured a huge amount of his own remaining personal fortune back into the company to keep the lights on, and the public story of Tesla was quietly, permanently being rewritten around a single name. The rescue came at the very last moment, and it came from several directions at once, not from one heroic bet. A final desperate funding round closed just before Christmas, literally in the final hours, with the chairman turned to chief executive putting in the last of what he could and strong-arming the other investors to match him. Not long after, a major established German car maker, seeing something in the technology worth owning, took a stake worth tens of millions of dollars. A vote of confidence that steadied the ship and validated the whole enterprise in the eyes of the world. And then a government loan program aimed at fuel-efficient vehicles handed the company a lifeline in the hundreds of millions, money large enough to fund the car that would actually matter. The sedan that came next, the first Tesla built from the ground up rather than borrowed from the British. Tesla did not survive because of one man's genius. It survived because a founder was forced out, an investor seized the wheel and emptied his pockets, a rival wrote a check, and a government stepped in, all within the same narrow window, while the original architects of the whole idea watched from the outside, some of them from behind a lawsuit. So let us end where these stories always end, with the two versions of how it could have gone, because both were live possibilities right up until the final hour. In the version that didn't happen, the last funding round fails. December 2008 arrives, the accounts hit zero, and the company cannot make payroll before the holidays. The Roadster becomes a curiosity. A few hundred expensive cars owned by collectors and true believers, a beautiful answer to a question the world was not yet willing to fund. The batteries, the motors, the software, all of it gets sold off for scraps or quietly absorbed by a bigger, safer company that files the patents away and does nothing with them. The idea that an electric car could be genuinely desirable survives because you cannot unsee a fast electric car once you have watched one. But the company that proved it does not. And in that timeline, the name Tesla means nothing to you. It is trivia. A footnote in a business school lecture about brilliant startups that were right, but a decade too early. And in the version that did happen, the check clears. The doors stay open through the holidays. The expensive little sports car does its job, proves the point, funds the sedan, which funds the cheaper car, which funds the factories and the battery plants, exactly as that cold little three-step plan had predicted years earlier when nobody was listening. The technology climbs down the price ladder rung by rung, just as promised. The company that half of Wall Street expected to die becomes, for a time, the most valuable car maker in the world, worth more than the century-old giants that once laughed at it. And the man who arrived as an investor, who was not there at the founding, who did not have the original idea and did not choose the name, becomes so completely fused with the story in the public mind that most people go their whole lives never learning that there was anyone there before him at all. That is the real origin of Tesla. Not a lone genius and a clean vision, but two forgotten founders, a borrowed British body, a battery stitched together from thousands of laptop cells, a promise that cost far more than it sold for, a boardroom knife fight over credit that ended careers and started lawsuits, and a company that came within a few days of vanishing entirely just as the world caught fire around it. The car that supposedly saved the future almost never got out of the garage. And the clean, heroic story you were told about who built